She couldn't even finish college, and now she thinks she can judge me, Bo sneered, yanking the cuffs of his tailored suit down to flash a heavy gold watch. The smell of polished koa wood, the icy hiss of the Honolulu courthouse air conditioning, and the sharp Pacific sunlight cutting through the hallway, glass hit my senses all at once. He was leaning against the wall, talking to his high-priced defense attorney, laughing right in my face. He assumed I was just here to watch. He thought I was a minor character, a pathetic little sister showing up in a plain overcoat to fetch coffee for the real professionals. I am Scarlett Martin, 35. My own brother has spent 2 decades telling this family I would amount to nothing. Bo built his entire identity on being the golden boy, the self-made businessman who supposedly kept our ohana afloat. To maintain his fragile throne, he had to keep me pinned to the floor. He labeled me the dropout, the disappointment, the girl who pushed meaningless government paper. He needed me invisible, so he could hide the rot spreading through his own corporate ledger. He used my quiet nature as a shield, soaking up the praise, while I secretly paid the medical bills and covered the loans he took out to buy those silk ties. He thrived on my silence. I looked down at the thick manila file resting in my hands. Pressed hard against the cardboard cover was a heavy brass challenge coin, Uncle Kai's Navy diver coin. The raised metal anchor dug deep into my palm, cold and unyielding. The metal carried the weight of the deep ocean, a silent reminder of the men who did the ugly work in the dark. "Not judge," I said quietly, my thumb tracing the milled edge of the brass. "Convict." The heavy double doors of the courtroom swung open. The bailiff stepped out into the hallway, his voice echoing down the long corridor as he called for the prosecution to enter. Bo stopped breathing. The smug grin melted right off his jaw. He had no idea the very blood he spent his life draining had already drafted his federal indictment. Before I tell you exactly how the man who mocked my whole life ended up sweating on the wrong side of my courtroom, welcome to Violet Slow Vengeance. Tell me down in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is right now. Hit that like button if you have ever been buried by your own blood just so they could keep their crown. The thick smoky aroma of roasted kalua pig drifted through the rusted screen door, carrying the heavy scent of charred kiawe wood and steamed banana leaves. Heat radiated from the backyard imu pit, baking the humid Honolulu afternoon air until it felt like a damp wool blanket pressing against my skin. Under my bare feet, the rough, sun-baked wooden planks of the lanai scratched against my soles. It was a texture I knew by heart, the gritty foundation of the Martin family home. From the corner of the cramped kitchen, a beat-up radio broadcasted a local station. The signal faded in and out, wrapping a cheerful, plucking ukulele melody in a harsh layer of electronic static. I stood by the porcelain sink, my hands submerged in lukewarm, greasy dishwater. The suds had long since dissolved, leaving a murky gray film clinging to the edges of the cast iron pots. I scrubbed a burnt pan with a stiff wire brush. The metal bristles scraped against the iron in a steady, monotonous rhythm. Behind me, the dining chairs scraped against the linoleum floor. Lorna, my mother, moved around the center island with practiced, deliberate devotion. She held a large ceramic bowl filled to the brim with fresh poi and lomi-lomi salmon. She did not place it in the center of the table for sharing. She carried it directly to the head of the table and slid it across the polished wood. The heavy bowl stopped precisely inches from Bo's fingertips. "Eat up, baby?" Lorna said, her voice dripping with a thick, syrupy warmth she reserved exclusively for him. She reached out and patted his broad shoulder. "A growing boy building his empire needs his strength. You carry this whole family." Bo did not look up from his phone. He blindly reached for a fork, shoveling a massive portion of the pork onto his plate. He was 19, a self-proclaimed entrepreneur who traded shifts at the local docks for long hours, lounging in the shade, pretending to manage logistics. He wore a crisp, unwrinkled linen shirt that smelled of expensive, citrus-heavy cologne, a sharp contrast to the sweat and smoke suffocating the rest of the house. I stopped scrubbing. I let the wire brush sink to the bottom of the murky water. I turned my head, looking over my shoulder at the two of them. The kitchen felt miles wide, a physical chasm separating the chosen son from the designated servant. "I enlisted today," I said. My voice was quiet, breaking through the ukulele static. The words hung in the humid air, heavy and solid. I expected a shift in the room. I expected my mother to drop her serving spoon to turn around to ask a single question about the military, the commitment, or the danger. Lorna froze for a fraction of a second. Her hands slick with pork grease hovered over the table. Then she reached down, grabbed the hem of her floral apron, and wiped her fingers clean. She did not turn around to face me. She kept her back rigid, staring at the wall above the refrigerator. "The sink is backing up again. Scarlett," Lorna muttered, her tone entirely devoid of interest. "Focus on the dishes. We have guests coming for the luau tonight, and I refuse to let this house look like a mess." She wiped away my military service the exact same way she wiped the grease off her hands. A minor inconvenience. A smudge on her pristine domestic image. Bo finally looked up from his glowing screen. He leaned back in the heavy wooden chair, crossing his arms over his chest. A slow, mocking smirk stretched across his jawline. He let out a dry, breathy chuckle, shaking his head, as if I had just told a pathetic joke. "Jag, that's just paperwork, sis. Real men build things." The insult did not carry a raised voice. It did not require a shout. It was delivered with the casual, effortless cruelty of a predator swatting a fly. He picked up his fork and took a slow bite of the salmon, chewing with his mouth slightly open. He looked at me, waiting for the reaction, waiting for the tears, or the argument. I looked at his soft, manicured hands, hands that had never lifted a hammer, never dug a trench, and would never hold a rifle. Then I looked down at my own hands, raw and pruned from the harsh dish soap gripping the edge of the wet porcelain sink. I turned back around. I plunged my hands back into the cold, murky water and grabbed the wire brush. The scraping sound resumed harsh and rhythmic against the iron. In this house, my work was always someone else's punchline. Thwack, thwack, thwack. The rhythmic mechanical chopping of the ceiling fan blades cut through the stagnant air of my cramped apartment. The sound pulled me out of the suffocating heat of that old kitchen and dropped me into the isolated, sterile reality of the present. The only light in the small room came from a single, low-wattage yellow bulb hanging above the cheap laminate dining table. Outside the thin glass window, the Honolulu night was pitch black. The distant heavy crash of Pacific waves rolling against the shoreline offered a relentless, echoing drumbeat. I sat rigid in a metal folding chair. In front of me, the stark, blue-white glare of a laptop screen illuminated the dark circles under my eyes. My right hand hovered over the trackpad. The screen displayed a secure banking portal. The numbers glowed against the white background, sharp and undeniable. Minus $4,000. Destination Martin Enterprises commercial credit, a business loan modification, a loan standing entirely in Bo's name, a loan he defaulted on 3 months ago to maintain the illusion of his grand self-made logistics empire. I moved the cursor down the screen. Another line item, minus $2,800, destination Oahu General Hospital billing, Lorna's physical therapy and premium cardiology consultations. I reached out and picked up the thick stack of physical mail resting next to the laptop. The paper was cold to the touch. I slid my index finger under the glued flap of a fresh hospital invoice to tear it open. The stiff, sharp edge of the envelope sliced right through the top layer of my skin. A sharp, biting sting flared in my fingertip. I stopped moving. A single dark bead of crimson blood welled up from the paper cut. It swelled surface tension, holding it together for a second before it dropped. The blood hit the pristine white surface of the medical bill, soaking into the porous paper, leaving a permanent rusty stain right over my mother's printed name. I did not bandage the cut. I simply pressed my thumb against the wound, applying cold, blunt pressure to stop the bleeding. Bo spent his days posting photos on social media, shaking hands with local politicians, wearing tailored suits, and selling the image of the ultimate Ohana patriarch. He played the generous provider, the man holding the Martin family together through sheer grit and business acumen. The community praised him. Lorna worshipped him. They kept their pristine golden masks facing the sun. They never told the neighbors that the foundation of their entire existence was quietly funded by the sister they shoved into the shadows. I was the silent treasury. I absorbed the debt. I paid the premium bills. I kept the collection agencies from kicking in the door of that cedar-paneled house. I lifted my gaze from the glowing screen. Mounted on the dim plaster wall across the tiny kitchen hung a shadow box. Inside the dark wood frame rested a brittle, dried orchid lei. The once vibrant purple petals had faded into a dusty, fragile brown. They looked like crushed parchment. Resting on the bottom ledge of the frame, right below the flowers, was a heavy brass challenge coin. Uncle Kai's coin. I remembered the exact night he gave it to me. The air had tasted of heavy salt and approaching rain. He stood on the docks near Pearl Harbor wearing his faded navy jacket. His hands, scarred and calloused from decades of deep water diving, felt like rough sandpaper when he pressed the cold brass into my palm. He was a man who survived the crushing depths of the ocean, a man who understood the crushing weight of family expectations. He had looked at my young, exhausted face, seeing right through the stoic mask I wore to survive my brother's daily humiliations. The law is how the quiet ones fight back. His voice echoed in the silent apartment, rough and steady. He never yelled. He never postured. He simply did the lethal necessary work in the dark so the people on the surface could sleep. Uncle Kai was the only person in the Martin bloodline who recognized the iron in my spine. I turned my attention back to the laptop. The cursor blinked steadily next to the confirmation button. To the world, Bo was a titan. To Lorna, he was a savior. To both of them, my career as a military prosecutor was just a tedious, bureaucratic joke. They mocked the uniform. They sneered at the concept of public service. They took the hazard pay, the long nights, the brutal case files, and reduced my entire existence to a dismissive wave of the hand. I pressed down on the trackpad. A soft plastic click echoed in the kitchen. The screen refreshed. Payment confirmed. The digital numbers shifted, draining my account to keep the false king on his throne. I closed the laptop. The blue light vanished, plunging the room back into the dim yellow shadows. They spent my silence like it was theirs to spend. 6 months before the federal indictment landed on my desk, the Martin family gathered under the sprawling canopy of our backyard banyan tree. It was Lorna's 60th birthday. The humid evening air carried the rich, earthy scent of roasted Kahlua pork, straight from the smoldering Imu pit, mixing heavily with the sharp salt breeze rolling off the Pacific. Strands of amber string lights cast a warm golden glow over the broad leaves of the plumeria trees, illuminating the dozens of aunts, uncles, and cousins filling the patio. Their overlapping chatter blended with the soft, rhythmic strumming of a live ukulele band playing in the corner. It was the picture-perfect illusion of the Hawaiian ohana, a seamless, flawless display of unity and unconditional family support. I stood near the edge of the wooden deck, intentionally staying clear of the center crowd. Resting deep inside the pocket of my dark slacks was a crisp, heavy stock paper folded into perfect thirds. It was my official dispatch from Naval Special Warfare Command. A promotion, Lieutenant Commander. After years of grinding through grueling court-martials, deciphering classified evidence in windowless rooms, and enduring the silent isolation of the military justice system, I had earned the gold oak leaf. I brought the news tonight as a quiet offering, hoping to finally place a piece of undeniable documented honor into my mother's hands. The music halted. The sharp, high-pitched clink of a silver spoon striking a crystal champagne flute cut through the yard. Bo stepped into the brightest patch of light on the patio. He wore a tailored ivory linen suit that draped flawlessly over his shoulders, a stark contrast to my faded plain clothes. As he raised his glass, the heavy gold watch slipped down his wrist, catching the amber bulbs overhead. The crowd fell silent, turning their faces toward the golden boy. He smiled, soaking in the undivided attention. He began his toast, weaving a beautiful fabricated narrative about the enduring strength of our bloodline. He stood there holding a drink that cost more than a junior enlisted sailor's weekly rations and spun a tale of immense personal sacrifice. He told the crowd how he had single-handedly navigated the Martin household through treacherous financial waters over the past decade. He painted a vivid picture of his brilliant logistics company securing their future and how he proudly bore the crushing weight of our mother's premium cardiology bills without a single complaint. I listened to the smooth, practiced cadence of his voice. He was taking public credit for the exact bank transfers I initiated from my cramped, dimly lit kitchen on the first of every month. He was wearing my hazard pay wrapped around his wrist, using my silent labor to build his pedestal. Bo shifted his posture, his eyes scanning the quiet crowd until they locked onto me, standing in the shadows. The warm, brotherly smile thinned into a sharp, calculated smirk. He gestured toward me with his free hand, turning my mere presence into a prop for his performance. Some of us build companies. Bo projected, ensuring his tone carried to the furthest corners of the yard. Some of us push papers for the government and call it service. The insult hung in the humid air, thick and undeniable. He did not just dismiss my career, he erased the grinding, lethal reality of the military justice system and reduced my entire life's work to a clerical joke. He painted himself as the weary, self-made titan, and me as the lazy freeloader taking up space on the public payroll. I waited for a shift in the room. I looked at Lorna sitting in the place of honor at the head of the long dining table. She reached out, resting her hand over Bo's forearm in a show of deep maternal pride. She turned her gaze toward me. Her eyes held no defense, no reprimand for her son. She offered a soft, patronizing sigh, shaking her head with an expression of manufactured pity. "Oh, leave your sister alone, Bo!" Lorna cooed, her tone dripping with toxic, artificial sweetness. "She tries her best. She is just my little disappointment." A ripple of laughter spread through the patio. Uncles chuckled behind their imported beer bottles. Cousins exchanged amused, knowing glances. The collective mockery washed over me, a suffocating wave of public humiliation. They were drinking the liquor I paid for, eating the food my salary provided, and laughing at my expense to protect a lie. I did not step forward to correct the record. I did not pull the promotion dispatch from my pocket to prove my worth. I stood perfectly still, my boots rooted to the wooden deck. I slid my right hand deeper into my pocket. My fingers bypassed the crisp paper of the Navy dispatch and found the cold, solid brass of Uncle Kai's challenge coin. I wrapped my fist around it. The heavy milled edges of the metal bit into the raw flesh of my palm. I squeezed until the joints in my knuckles ached, driving the raised metal anchor into my skin, grounding myself in the sharp, biting pressure. The contrast was stark. They dealt in silk champagne and empty words. I dealt in iron blood and quiet endurance. The brass left a deep, crescent-shaped indentation in my hand, a physical brand of the reality I had to swallow. I looked at Bo, raising his crystal glass to the cheering family. He had won. He successfully stole my foundation and built his hollow throne directly on top of it. I said nothing. I always said nothing. The amber string lights suspended across the backyard had burned out one by one, leaving the wooden lanai swallowed by a thick, humid darkness. The lingering scent of spilled imported beer and extinguished citronella torches hung heavy in the stagnant air. The luau guests had dispersed, retreating to their vehicles with full stomachs and oblivious smiles, leaving behind a yard littered with empty bottles and half-eaten plates of Kahlua pork. I stood alone near the edge of the porch, letting the sharp, salty night breeze roll off the Pacific to cool the sting of the evening. In the distance, the faint rhythmic crash of waves breaking against the Pearl Harbor shoreline echoed through the quiet. It was a low, steady heartbeat of naval history, a reminder of men who bled in these waters long before I was born. The sliding glass door rattled harshly on its aluminum tracks. Bo stepped out into the shadows. He did not seek me out to apologize for the public humiliation at the dining table. He did not carry a single ounce of remorse in his relaxed, rolling gait. He carried a sleek black leather portfolio tucked tightly under his arm. He closed the distance between us, stopping a mere 2 feet away, deliberately invading my personal space. The suffocating manufactured stench of his expensive designer cologne instantly overpowered the clean ocean breeze. He flipped the portfolio open with a sharp snap of his wrist. His manicured fingers pulled out a crisp multi-page legal document. He shoved the stack of paper directly toward my chest. "I need a guarantor for the new shipping logistics contract," Bo stated. It was not a request. It was a tactical command delivered from a monarch to a foot soldier. "The lenders are getting strict. They need a signature with a stable federal salary attached to it. Sign the bottom line on page 4, and I will handle the rest." He held out a silver fountain pen. The polished metal caught the faint moonlight. He expected me to take it without hesitation. He expected the obedient, invisible sister to absorb another massive financial liability just to keep his fragile, debt-ridden empire afloat. It was the dynamic we had operated under for a decade. He took the applause in the daylight, and I quietly subsidized his risk in the dark. I looked down at the dense paragraphs of the contract, my eyes catching the predatory interest rates glaring in bold ink. Then I slowly tilted my head up, locking my gaze dead onto his pupils. I did not reach for the pen. My hands remained firmly at my sides, locked in a rigid, unwavering parade rest. "No, Bo," I said. My voice was a flat, cold whisper against the ocean wind. "Not this one." His extended hand froze mid-air. The silver pen hovered uselessly in the dark space between us. For a split second, genuine, unadulterated confusion fractured his polished features. His brain simply could not process the concept of resistance from his designated punching bag. He blinked the gears in his head, stalling as he stared at my empty hands. Then the confusion curdled into a sharp, ugly sneer. His jaw tightened. He let out a dry, condescending laugh, shaking his head as if I were a toddler speaking out of turn at an adult table. He tapped the pen against the paper, a patronizing, rhythmic click. "You couldn't even finish college." Bo mocked, his upper lip curling upward in pure contempt. "And now you want to lecture me?" The insult was a precision strike designed to cut me down at the knees. It was formulated to trigger tears, to force me into a defensive argument about my credentials, to make me emotional. I gave him nothing. I did not break my posture. I simply turned my head, looking past his shoulder, out across the black water of the bay. Beneath those dark waves lay the rusted steel hulls of sunken battleships, the silent aquatic graves of men who understood the true crushing weight of a sacrifice. Uncle Kai had spent his life diving into those unforgiving depths, pulling bodies from the wreckage. The real warriors, the ones who actually held the line, never needed to brag at a family dinner party. I turned my back on my brother. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my intellect, my rank, or my bank account. I walked down the wooden steps, my boots striking the gravel driveway in a steady, unbroken cadence. He mistook my patience for permission. The drive to the naval base was a blur of empty asphalt and flickering amber streetlights. At 0200 hours, the Judge Advocate General building was a concrete ghost town. The air inside the corridor was sterile, stripped of any tropical Hawaiian warmth, smelling faintly of industrial floor wax and burnt coffee grounds. I swiped my military ID card. The heavy magnetic lock disengaged with a sharp metallic thud, granting me entry to the secure prosecution wing. The overhead fluorescent tubes buzzed, casting long pale shadows across the quiet hallway. I walked into my private office and pushed the heavy oak door shut. The silence in the room was absolute, a vacuum waiting to be filled. Resting dead center on my polished wooden desk was a thick sealed manila folder. It bore the stark, red-stamped insignia of the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. Priority handling. I dropped my car keys on the table, the metal scraping harshly against the wood grain. I reached out, breaking the tamper-evident tape with my thumb, and flipped the heavy cardboard cover open. The harsh overhead light hit the bold black ink of the indictment summary. Subject of investigation, corporate logistics and procurement fraud. Primary defendant, Bo Martin. The oxygen evaporated from my lungs. A sudden biting chill shot straight down my spine, freezing the blood in my veins. My eyes darted across the printed pages, scanning the raw, undeniable evidence. forged shipping manifests, phantom military contracts, invoices for naval vessel parts that never existed, embezzled federal funds funneled through offshore shell companies. The financial numbers printed on the evidence logs matched the exact vendor names Bo had bragged about at dinner hours earlier. The golden boy, the self-proclaimed titan of the Ohana, was not a businessman. He was a parasite feeding directly on the United States defense budget. I sank slowly into my leather chair, the ethical dilemma wrapped around my throat like an iron wire choking me. For years, I had quietly covered his personal debts, paying off credit cards in the dark to maintain the sacred, unwritten island rule of family loyalty. I suspected his ledgers were dirty. I saw the inconsistencies in his lavish spending, but I chose to look the other way to keep the peace. I traded my own financial stability to protect a criminal. Now the bill had come due. If I recused myself from this case, if I cited a conflict of interest, handed the file to another prosecutor, and walked away, I would be nothing more than a coward, hiding behind biological ties. I would be shielding the very rot I swore a commissioned oath to eradicate. I would be proving him right. I looked up at the wall across from my desk. Hanging there was the dried, brittle orchid lei Uncle Kai had given me on the day of my commissioning. Next to it, the stark type pages of the federal indictment. I reached into the deep pocket of my trousers. My fingers traced the familiar milled edges of Uncle Kai's brass challenge coin. I pulled it out into the harsh light of the office. The metal was warm from my body heat. I set it down on the desk, resting it right next to the damning NCIS report. The heavy brass clicked against the wood, a solid grounding sound cutting through the quiet. I stared at the anchor struck into the coin, then at the name printed on the federal charge sheet. Bo spent his entire life telling the world I lacked the spine to stand in his arena. He demanded a stage. He demanded an audience to witness his greatness. Now he was going to get one. Only this time I dictated the rules of engagement, not judge. I thought my jaw locking tight as I reached for a red pen. Convict. The law is how the quiet ones fight back. Uncle Kai never told me it would cost this much. The digital clock on the wall shifted to Zo 3:15. The Judge Advocate General corridor was a concrete tomb stripped of all daylight and human warmth. Inside my office, the only sound breaking the heavy silence was the rhythmic mechanical whir of the laser printer. It pulled crisp white sheets from the tray, burning thick black ink into the paper and spitting them out in a steady, relentless cadence. The enclosed space smelled of hot toner ozone and a ceramic mug of black coffee that had gone cold hours ago. I sat behind my desk, bathed in the sharp, pale glare of a single brass reading lamp. Spread across the polished wood were the remnants of Bo's fabricated empire. Earlier that evening, NCIS Special Agent Torres had walked into my office. He did not offer a polite greeting. He simply unlatched a heavy leather briefcase and began stacking manila folders in front of me. He laid out the anatomy of a federal crime with surgical precision. I spent the next 4 hours tracing the digital footprints of the man who shared my last name. My index finger traced a highlighted row of numbers on a bank ledger. The paper felt coarse under my skin. I stared at the signature at the bottom of a fraudulent Department of Defense procurement form. The looping, arrogant cursive belonged to Bo. He had billed the naval shipyard for hundreds of titanium engine components that never existed, routing the federal funds through a maze of offshore shell accounts. He thought he was untouchable. He assumed the military bureaucracy was a slow, blind beast. He never factored in the fact that his own sister was the apex predator waiting in the dark to audit the paperwork he so deeply despised. I stacked the printed pages, tapping the bottom edges against the desk to align them perfectly. I set the finalized prosecution file down. Resting on the right side of the desk was the brittle dried orchid lei, its petals fragile as old parchment. Sitting directly on top of the indictment cover, pressing the criminal charges flat, was Uncle Kai's heavy brass challenge coin. The dull metal anchor caught the lamplight. The weapon was fully armed. The safety was off. I just needed authorization to pull the trigger. I picked up the secure landline receiver. I dialed the direct extension for Captain Elias Thorne, my commanding officer. The encrypted line trilled twice before a gruff, sleep-deprived voice answered. Thorne, he answered his tone, carrying the raw, gravelly edge of a man who practically lived in his uniform. Sir, it is Lieutenant Commander Martin, I said, keeping my voice level devoid of any personal inflection. I am calling to formally brief you on the logistics fraud docket. I laid out the operational facts. I detailed the shell companies, the forged shipping manifests, and the wire transfers. Then I delivered the final variable. The primary defendant orchestrating the embezzlement is Beau Martin. I stated the words cutting through the sterile static of the phone line. He is my biological brother. A long, heavy pause hung over the receiver. The only sound was Thorne's slow, measured exhale. He was a veteran prosecutor, a man who understood the lethal political minefields of a familial conflict of interest. Do you need a formal recusal, Scarlett? Thorne asked, his voice dropping into a careful protective register. I can pull you off the roster, reassign the docket to another team. Nobody would question it. I looked down at the brass coin resting on the fraudulent signature. Recusing myself meant handing the blade to someone else. It meant shrinking back into the shadows and letting Beau dictate my boundaries once again. No, sir, I replied, my grip tightening on the plastic receiver. The chain of custody is pristine. I am officially declaring the biological relation for the transparency record, but my jurisdiction holds. I want to try this case. Another beat of silence. Then the sound of a chair squeaking on the other end of the line. By the book, Commander, Thorne ordered, his tone hardening into solid steel. Take him down. Copy that, sir. I hung up the phone. The system was locked. The legal machinery of the United States Navy was now standing directly behind me. But before the sun came up, before the gavel fell, I had to sever one final lingering thread. I picked up my personal cell phone. I dialed the Honolulu area code. It rang 4 times before the line clicked open. The rustle of cotton bedsheets hissed over the speaker. Scarlett, Lorna groaned, her voice instantly laced with thick, unfiltered irritation at the late hour. Do you have any idea what time it is? I did not apologize for waking her. I did not ask how she was feeling. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk. Mom, I asked, my voice barely a whisper in the quiet office. Beau's logistics company. Have you ever actually seen a single piece of his shipping cargo? Have you ever questioned where the money comes from? A sharp, annoyed huff echoed through the phone. What kind of ridiculous question is that in the middle of the night? Lorna snapped, her defensive instinct flaring up to shield her golden child. He provides for this house. He works his fingers to the bone to keep us afloat, while you sit in some cubicle shuffling meaningless papers. He is stealing, Mom. Stop it, Lorna hissed, her tone venomous and unyielding. He is your brother. Ohana protects Ohana, Scarlett. Stop being so jealous of his success, and go to sleep. The blind devotion, the final desperate clinging to a lie. She was willing to ignore federal crimes as long as the illusion of the perfect son remained intact. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice to present the evidence. I simply pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the end button. The screen went black. I placed the dead device face down on the wood. The printer finally stopped running. The silence settled over the room, heavier this time, but incredibly clean. Family was a debt I had paid alone for 20 years. Tomorrow, I would stop paying. She couldn't even finish college, and now she thinks she can judge me. Beau sneered, yanking the cuffs of his tailored suit down to flash a heavy gold watch. He stood in the hallway of the Honolulu Federal Courthouse, leaning casually against the polished koa wood paneling. Beside him, his high-priced defense attorney chuckled, adjusting a custom silk tie. The icy hiss of the air conditioning vents and the sharp Pacific sunlight cutting through the hallway glass hit my senses, creating a sterile, unforgiving atmosphere. Beau looked right at me, his upper lip curling into that familiar, condescending smirk. He assumed I was just here to watch. He thought I was a minor character, a pathetic little sister showing up in a plain tan overcoat to fetch coffee and witness the golden boy beat a minor bureaucratic misunderstanding. I stood 10 feet away, the fabric of my coat buttoned up to my chin, hiding the truth underneath. I looked down at the thick manila file resting in my hands. Pressed hard against the cardboard cover was Uncle Kai's heavy brass challenge coin. The raised metal anchor dug deep into my palm, cold and unyielding. The metal carried the weight of the deep ocean, a silent reminder of the men who did the ugly work in the dark. "Not judge," I said quietly, my thumb tracing the milled edge of the brass. "Convict." Bo let out a dry, dismissive laugh and turned his back to me, returning his attention to his lawyer. He did not hear the heavy footsteps approaching from the inside. The imposing double doors of the courtroom swung open. The brass hinges groaned a deep, resonant sound that echoed down the long corridor. The bailiff stepped out holding a structured clipboard. He did not look at Bo. He looked directly at me. "All rise," the bailiff announced, his voice projecting with unmistakable authority. "The United States versus Bo Martin. For the prosecution, Lieutenant Commander Scarlett, Martin Judge Advocate General's Corps." Bo froze. His spine snapped straight. The defense attorney frowned, his eyes darting from the bailiff to the woman standing in the cheap tan coat. I stepped forward. My fingers unfastened the top button of the overcoat, then the second, then the third. I shrugged the heavy fabric off my shoulders and let it drape over the back of a wooden hallway bench. The disguise was gone. Underneath, I wore my pristine Navy service dress white uniform. The fabric was immaculate, starched to a razor-sharp edge. The gold oak leaf pinned to my collar caught the overhead fluorescent light gleaming with undeniable jurisdiction. Rows of service ribbons sat perfectly squared over my left breast, a documented history of endurance tactical operations and survival. I walked past my brother. I did not look at him. I did not offer a smirk or a clever remark. The sharp rhythmic click of my black dress shoes striking the marble floor commanded the space. I crossed the threshold. The power dynamic in the room flipped 180 degrees in a fraction of a second. I walked straight to the prosecution table on the right side of the aisle. I set my manila file down on the polished mahogany. I placed the brass challenge coin right next to the microphone. Bo stumbled into the courtroom behind me. His confident swagger had evaporated. He walked with the heavy, uncoordinated steps of a man approaching the gallows. He took his seat at the defense table, his hands trembling as he pulled out his leather chair. Sitting in the first row of the gallery just behind the wooden partition was Lorna. She had come wearing her Sunday best to watch her son secure another victory. Her eyes locked onto my uniform, tracking the gold rank on my collar and the military seal on my briefcase. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her skin a sickly pale gray. Her manicured hands gripped the edge of the wooden pew so hard her knuckles turned bone white. She finally realized the daughter she called a disappointment held the leash to her son's freedom. He stopped breathing. For the first time, so did the whole room. The judge entered the chamber, his black robes billowing slightly as he took his seat at the elevated bench. The heavy wooden gavel struck the sound block. The sharp crack signaled the end of the Martin family's fabricated reality. The trial commenced. I did not seek emotional vengeance. I did not raise my voice to match the years of shouting I had endured in our childhood home. The courtroom was my domain, and here restraint was the deadliest weapon. I stood behind the wooden podium. I opened the manila folder. The rustle of crisp paper was the only sound in the dead quiet room. "Your Honor," I began, my tone level, analytical, and precise. "The government will prove a systematic, intentional defrauding of the United States Navy. The defendant orchestrated a complex embezzlement scheme, utilizing forged shipping manifests to siphon federal defense funds into personal offshore accounts." I pulled the first document from the stack, a fraudulent procurement form. I laid it flat on the evidence projector. Smack! The heavy paper hit the glass. "Exhibit A," I stated, "billing records for titanium components that never materialized on any naval vessel." I pulled a bank ledger. Smack! Exhibit B, the routing numbers connecting the defense payouts directly to the defendant's private commercial credit line. I presented the signature verification. Smack! Exhibit C, the defendant's own handwriting authorizing the transfers. With every piece of paper hitting the desk, the walls of the courtroom closed in around Bo. His defense attorney tried to mount an objection, scrambling to cite procedural errors. The judge overruled him without a second thought. The paper trail was pristine. The evidence was an iron cage built meticulously in the dark, and now exposed in the blinding light of the justice system. Bo was suffocating. He tugged at the collar of his expensive silk shirt, gasping for air in the climate-controlled room. The heavy gold watch on his wrist clanked against the wooden table as his hands shook. He was watching his empire burn to ash in real time, dismantled by the very person he had spent a lifetime erasing. He looked back at Lorna in the gallery. She sat frozen, unable to offer him a single word of comfort, unable to shield him from the federal government. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His money could not buy his way out of this room. His charm held zero currency here. He could not handle the silence. He could not handle the cold, methodical destruction of his ego. The narcissist's ultimate defense mechanism triggered. He bypassed his lawyer. He pushed his chair back. The wood screeched against the floorboards, a harsh grating noise that made the court reporter flinch. He stood up, pointing a shaking finger directly at me, his face flushed a dark, angry red. "She couldn't even finish college," Bo shouted, his voice cracking, echoing off the high vaulted ceiling. "She does not know what she is talking about. This is a mistake. She is just a paper pusher." The outburst hung in the air, pathetic and desperate. It was the same insult he had used to cut me down on the lanai under the plumeria trees, the same line he used to entertain his friends. But here, under the seal of the federal court, it carried zero weight. It just proved his lack of control. Crack! The judge struck the gavel. "Mr. Martin, contain yourself, or I will have the bailiff remove you from this room. Your counsel will speak for you." Bo sank back into his chair, his chest heaving, his eyes darting wildly around the gallery, looking for an ally. There were none. His lawyer leaned over, hissing a harsh reprimand into his ear, forcing him to stay seated. I turned my head slowly. I looked at the judge. My posture remained flawless, my hands resting lightly on the edges of the podium. "Your Honor," I said, my voice calm, projecting effortlessly over the microphone. "Whether I finished college has no bearing on the paper trail in front of you." I looked down at the prosecution table. The heavy brass challenge coin sat firm and resolute against the wood, a symbol of blood iron and quiet endurance. Across the aisle, Bo's gold watch slipped down his sweaty wrist, a meaningless trinket bought with stolen money. The metal of the quiet fighters had officially crushed the silk of the frauds. I closed the evidence file. The thick cardboard cover shut with a definitive thud. I sat down in my chair, keeping my eyes locked straight ahead. 20 years of his voice. 10 minutes of mine. Mine won. The jury deliberation took exactly 3 hours and 12 minutes. When the heavy wooden door adjacent to the jury box clicked open, the shift in the room was palpable. 12 men and women filed into their designated seats, their faces carved from stone, refusing to cast a single glance toward the defense table. In any courtroom, that specific brand of silence is a definitive executioner. Bo sat stiffly in his leather chair. The tailored silk suit he had worn like a suit of armor all week now hung awkwardly over his slouching shoulders. A thin, frantic sheen of sweat coated his forehead, catching the pale fluorescent lights overhead. His defense attorney stared straight down at a blank legal pad, tapping a silver pen against the wood in a slow, defeated rhythm. The judge instructed the defendant to rise. Bo pushed himself up. His knees trembled, knocking lightly against the edge of the mahogany table. He gripped the wood to keep himself upright. On the first count of the indictment defrauding the United States government, the jury foreman read, unfolding a crisp sheet of paper. His voice projected clear and unforgiving across the quiet chamber. "We find the defendant guilty." Bo let out a sharp, choked gasp, as if the air had been physically punched out of his lungs. "On the second count, wire fraud and embezzlement of federal funds. We find the defendant guilty. On the third count, forgery of official naval procurement documents. We find the defendant guilty." The foreman read through all 7 charges, 7 unyielding strikes, 7 guilty verdicts. The judge brought the heavy wooden gavel down. The sharp, dry crack echoed off the vaulted ceiling, sealing the fate of the golden boy. The illusion of the self-made logistics titan shattered into worthless, invisible fragments right there on the courtroom floor. Bo turned his head frantically. His chest heaved in short, erratic bursts. He looked past the wooden partition, searching the first row of the gallery. He sought the one safety net that had caught him every single time he fell, the one audience member who had spent a lifetime applauding his every misstep. "Mom," Bo whispered, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic pitch. "Mom, tell them I did this for the family." Lorna sat frozen on the wooden pew. The proud matriarchal posture she had carried into the courthouse was gone. The woman who had consistently favored the son over the daughter, who had turned a blind eye to every discrepancy to protect her own social standing, finally faced the inescapable reality of federal law. She saw the armed marshals stepping into the aisle. She saw the reporters sketching notes in the back rows. The instinct for self-preservation kicked in, overriding decades of blind devotion. Lorna did not stand up to defend him. She did not raise her voice to shield her boy. She slowly lowered her head, breaking eye contact, and stared intently at the scuffed toes of her shoes. She shrank into the shadows of the wooden bench, abandoning the sinking ship to save herself from the undertow. The enabler had officially discarded the fraud. Bo stared at his mother's bowed head. His jaw slacked. The betrayal registered in his bloodshot eyes, a devastating realization that the ohana he bragged about was nothing more than a transactional fantasy. When the money vanished, so did the loyalty. "Mr. Martin," the lead federal marshal ordered, stepping up behind the defense table. "Place your hands behind your back." The command triggered a primal, irrational panic. The narcissist stripped of his money, his mother, and his freedom snapped. He refused to accept the concrete walls closing in on him. His wild, desperate eyes darted across the room and locked onto me. "You set me up," Bo roared, a guttural, feral sound tearing from his throat. He shoved his defense attorney aside, sending the man stumbling into a chair. Bo lunged forward, charging around the heavy wooden table, his arms outstretched, aiming directly for the lapels of my white uniform. He wanted to drag me down into the dirt with him. He wanted to inflict one final physical humiliation to prove he was still the dominant sibling. I did not flinch. I did not step backward. As his hands reached for my collar, I pivoted my hips, shifting my center of gravity off the direct line of Ataue attack. I brought my left forearm up in a sharp, calculated sweep, deflecting his right wrist outward. The kinetic momentum of his own desperate charge carried him past me. I sidestepped, leaving him grasping at empty air. He lost his footing on the polished marble floor. Before he could recover, 2 federal marshals crashed into his shoulders, driving his upper body hard against the edge of the prosecution table. The impact forced the breath from his lungs in a harsh wheeze. They pinned him to the wood, twisting his arms behind his back. The heavy metallic ratcheting of steel handcuffs echoed sharp and cold in the silent courtroom. I stood exactly where I had been, my uniform, untouched, my posture, immaculate. I looked down at the man, groaning against the mahogany. "I kept the family alive. Scarlet," Bo choked out, pressing his bruised cheek against the desk, still desperately clinging to his fabricated martyrdom. "You take me away? The bank takes the house. Mom loses her care. You just destroyed your own blood." I reached into the pocket of my uniform trousers. My fingers brushed the cool brass surface of Uncle Kai's challenge coin. I pulled it out, resting the heavy metal in the palm of my hand. The brass slowly absorbed my body heat, warming against my skin, a silent tether to the uncle who taught me the quiet mechanics of survival. I pictured the brittle dry petals of his lei hanging on my apartment wall, enduring the test of time, long after the vibrant colors faded. I looked down at Bo. I did not raise my voice to match his hysteria. I delivered the final fatal assessment with the clinical detachment of an auditor closing a bankrupt account. "You never kept the family alive, Bo." I stated, my voice low, caring only to the men standing around the table. "You just held the microphone while I paid the band." Bo squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head against the wood. The commercial credit line you defaulted on 3 months ago, I continued reciting the exact financial numbers from memory. The one keeping Martin Enterprises from folding. I intercepted the collections. I assumed the monthly premium. He stopped struggling against the marshals. His eyes snapped open, staring sideways at my polished black shoes. The premium cardiology invoices from Oahu General, I said, letting the reality sink into his skull. The physical therapy sessions for Mom. I handled the routing numbers on the first of every month for the last 4 years. You never spent a single dime of your own logistics revenue on this family. You spent it on silk suits, imported watches, and cocktail parties. He tried to speak, but his throat clicked dryly. I did not destroy your company today. I told him, stepping a few inches closer, ensuring he heard every syllable. I simply logged into the banking portal this morning and canceled the automatic transfers. The hospital billing department will contact you by Friday. The commercial lenders will file the foreclosure paperwork on the house by next week. The system is coming for you, Bo. I did not have to ruin him. I did not have to wage a vindictive emotional war to exact my revenge. I just had to stop shielding him from the consequences of his own profound mediocrity. You are going to a federal penitentiary. I said, my tone as cold and steady as the Pacific tide. And you will face that sentence, knowing you are entirely, undeniably unremarkable. I dropped the heavy brass coin into my pocket. Your access to my life is permanently revoked. I turned away from the defense table, picking up my leather briefcase. The marshals hauled Bo to his feet. He did not yell this time. He did not struggle. The fight was completely drained from his muscles. He hung his head, his shoulders sagging beneath the wrinkled suit jacket, a hollow shell being escorted out of the chamber. I walked down the center aisle, my heels clicking in a slow, measured cadence. I did not glance at the gallery. I did not look at Lorna shivering on the wooden pew. The invisible daughter had finalized the ledger. I didn't destroy him. I just stopped being the floor he stood on. The federal justice system does not operate on swift, emotional vengeance. It grinds forward like a glacier, methodical, cold, and entirely inescapable. 3 months after the gavel struck the sound block in that Honolulu courtroom, the physical reality of Bo's conviction finally manifested on the asphalt. I did not drive past the old cedar-paneled house to watch the empire fall, but the public record detailed the foreclosure with clinical precision. The commercial lenders reclaimed the property. The bank sent a heavy diesel tow truck to the driveway on a humid Tuesday morning. The hydraulic winch screamed a high-pitched mechanical whine, tearing through the quiet suburban neighborhood as the thick steel cables hooked onto the front axle of Bo's leased luxury SUV. The heavy tires scraped harshly across the concrete, dragging his pristine status symbol onto the rusted flatbed. The neighbors, the same aunts and uncles who had raised their crystal champagne flutes to his manufactured success under the plumeria trees, watched from their porches in dead silence. Nobody stepped forward to offer a loan. Nobody intervened. The fake dynasty was repossessed piece by piece until nothing remained but empty rooms and unpaid invoices. Bo was transferred to a federal correctional institution on the mainland, thousands of miles away from the warm Pacific sun. He was facing a 72-month sentence. The tailored ivory silk suits were confiscated, replaced by stiff, abrasive khaki cotton. His world shrank to a windowless concrete cell and a bolted metal bunk. He tried to leverage his old network. He dialed the high society politicians and the defense contractors who used to drink his imported liquor. The automated prison operator announced his name, and one by one the receivers clicked dead. The men who praised his business acumen erased his phone number the exact second he became a federal liability. He was isolated, locked inside a cage built entirely by his own predatory greed. Lorna had to vacate the property. She relocated to a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the industrial outskirts of the island. Her premium cardiology care transitioned to standard state coverage. The golden child she had shielded from every consequence could not shield her from the eviction notice. I sat in my office at the Judge Advocate General Headquarters. The air smelled of fresh morning rain, and the faint hint of salt water blowing through the open window. The brittle dried orchid lei was gone from my wall. In its place hung a framed charter for the Kai Martin Legal Defense Fund. I had taken a significant portion of my accrued savings and seeded a foundation dedicated exclusively to active duty service members facing financial exploitation from their own relatives. Resting on my desk was a fresh case file. A 19-year-old Navy mechanic whose parents had secretly opened 5 lines of credit in his name while he was deployed on a Pacific carrier. They drained his future to fund their present, relying on the same toxic familial manipulation I knew intimately. I uncapped my heavy silver pen. The dark ink flowed smooth and steady across the injunction paperwork. I was building a legal perimeter for the enlisted kids who thought they had to suffer in silence. I turned the exact pain my family inflicted upon me into a titanium shield for someone else. The landline on my desk trilled. I checked the caller ID, a local Honolulu number. I picked up the plastic receiver. "Scarlett," Lorna said. Her voice was thin, fragile, stripped of the patronizing artificial sweetness she used to wield at the dining table. "I received the forwarding address for the mail. I just wanted to say thank you." She paused, the static of the line filling the empty gap. She was waiting for me to soften, waiting for the familiar invisible daughter who always absorbed the blows and begged for scraps of affection. "I was wrong," Lorna whispered, her breath hitching over the speaker. "I should have seen what he was doing. I should have protected you. I am so sorry." I leaned back in my leather chair. I did not feel a rush of vindictive triumph. I did not feel the urge to scream or punish her. The deep gnawing anger had burned itself out, leaving behind a clear, unburdened peace. "I accept your apology, Mom." I said, my tone even and measured. But the dynamic is permanently changed. True ohana is about holding each other accountable to the truth. It is about protecting each other from the rot not bearing the rot to protect an image. If we speak moving forward, we speak in reality. No more hiding. Lorna let out a slow, trembling exhale. "I understand." I hung up the phone. The boundary was set. The line was drawn in solid stone. Late that afternoon, I drove up the steep winding road to the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific. The Punch Bowl crater rested high above the city, a sprawling, sacred expanse of manicured green grass and uniform white marble headstones. The Pacific trade winds whipped through the tall monkey-pod trees carrying the sweet, heavy fragrance of blooming flowers. I walked down the long, quiet row until I reached Uncle Kai's marker. I knelt on the damp earth. I held a fresh, vibrant purple orchid lei in my hands. The thick petals were cool, soft, and alive with vibrant color. I draped the woven flowers gently over the top curve of the white marble. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the brass challenge coin. The metal was heavy scarred from years of deployment and trials. I set it down on the flat base of the headstone, the raised anchor catching the warm golden rays of the descending sun. "You were right, Uncle," I said quietly, the wind carrying the words out toward the harbor. "The quiet ones do fight back." I stood up, brushing a blade of grass from my dark trousers. I looked out over the sweeping vista. Below the crater, the deep blue waters of Pearl Harbor stretched out toward the horizon. The setting sun painted the sky in vivid strokes of bruised purple, burnt orange, and brilliant gold. The distant, rhythmic crash of the surf against the shoreline provided a steady, eternal heartbeat. Somewhere down on the beach, a lone musician was playing a ukulele. The melody was slow, unhurried, floating on the evening breeze. It was the authentic sound of the island stripped of the fake commercialized performances my brother used to fund. I took a deep breath. My lungs expanded, pulling in the clean, untainted ocean air. The heavy, invisible chain that had dragged behind me for 2 decades was gone. I did not have to prove my worth to people who were committed to misunderstanding me. I did not have to finance my own humiliation. The war for their approval was over. I was finally home. If you have ever had to stop being the floor for someone else to stand on, if you have ever had to sever toxic bloodlines to find your own peace, welcome to the club. Hit that like button, comment the word aloha down below, and and make sure you subscribe to Violet Slow Vengeance. We build our own armor here. See you in the next one.